Okay. Yeah, I have to tell you that although I'm talking about the Adirondacks, I'm not a native Adirondack person because I grew up out near Seattle in Washington State, and they were having this war, you know. Otherwise, I'd probably still be out there looking for a husband. But this fella came along and wanted to bring me to the Adirondacks, which he said was God's country, and I've been trying to figure that out ever since. So I've only been here for 65 years, you see. And of course, the first thing we did was we came up here and we had a large family. It was because of my bad ears, you know. I have these really bad ears, and although I could, my number one daughter over there is dying. We call her the first sergeant. She was number one. She turned out to be so good we went right along and had 6 more. So it was my bad ears. You see, we would go to bed at night and I couldn't read his lips anymore, and he'd say, "You want to go to sleep or what?" And I'd say, "What?" Now we've got that out of the way. You can breathe again. Okay, so just to give you an idea of where I came from in the first place, my grandfather was Paul Bunyan. When I was in grade school, I have to read everything because I'm so ancient I can't remember what I'm saying from one minute to the next, so I read things a lot, so I hope you don't mind. When I was in grade school in Renton, Washington, a suburb of Seattle, there was a big mural on the art room wall depicting the cook skating along on slabs of bacon to grease a gigantic griddle for Paul Bunyan's pancakes. Paul Bunyan has always been big in the Northwest. He was my grandfather. Let me tell you about him. He was born on an island off the coast of Maine, Mount Desert Island to be exact. He logged his way across the continent and wound up on the west coast. Maybe you've heard about all those lakes in Wisconsin. That's because Paul Bunyan cut down all those trees and stomped them in the ground and made all those lakes. Wisconsin is where grandfather met a girl from Canada. He married her and they had 4 children. One of them was my mother. Well, sir, he cut down all the trees in those parts and then he moved on. Pretty soon he came to Montana, where those Rocky Mountains were almost as big as he was. He ran a logging camp there at Swan Lake, up in the Bitterroot Mountains, and kept the Great Northern Railroad going with all those railroad ties he supplied, just about the size of his toothpicks. That Montana was such a cold place. When the loggers made the rounds from one bar to another in the winter, all the outdoor conversation that they had got frozen as soon as they said it, and it was a very quiet winter. And then along came spring, when it all thawed out. The roar was so deafening, everybody had to hide out inside until it all went away. My mother grew up and taught school in Montana. She married a carpenter who wound up working for her father. She hated school teaching anyway. My big brother was born at the next logging camp up in the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. The rest of us kids were all born in that little town just outside of Seattle. So that was my grandfather, Paul Bunyan. 7 axe handles broad across the shoulders. I remember a big man, bigger than life. He died when I was 6 years old. Everybody's big when you're 6 years old. His real name was James Craney, and his build was probably pretty ordinary, but his logging camps were the stuff of legends. Every now and then one of those old logs, usually bow-legged Jimmy McGargle, would show up and take us kids downtown for ice cream. My brothers went every summer to the camp. When they came back in the fall, they brought back intriguing souvenirs. Once it was an old toaster they'd found in the dump, the kind that had the sides that go down and flip the toast for you. They fixed it up and we used it for years. We were also treated to wonderful tales of their escapades in the dining hall, where they spread salt all over the tables and skated back and forth on them. My Aunt Emma was in charge of them, and she encouraged creative entertainment. The logs used to come down from the mountains on flat cars on the railroad that went by our house. This part is true. Often it took 2 flat cars to carry 1 log. Later on, they got so small that there were 3 on 1 car. Somewhere I have a picture of 6 loggers sitting in the notch of one of those big trees before they finished cutting it. Some people believe me. When Paul Bunyan got to the West Coast, that's where Babe, the big blue ox, ran away with the plow and dug Hood's Canal out in the Olympic Peninsula. If you ever happen to visit the West Coast, give yourself a treat. Go up into the Cascade Mountains and visit Snoqualmie Falls. Right near there is a range of hills, small by Western measurement, but big if you're from the east. They're right there a little north of Issaquah and west of North Bend. That's where Paul Bunyan laid himself down when he was all through. That was my grandfather. So now that you know all about where I came from, we need to talk about some of the cooking that I got into. You see, when I got here, you know, I was, was I 19 or 20? And I didn't know anything about cooking, but my mother gave me this book that said The Joy of Cooking, and I was supposed to learn how to cook. So we were living in this tent, this army tent, just outside of Chestertown. Anybody from up that way? Oh yeah, good, good. And we were building this house up on the hill, and we put this tent right down by the brook because it was nice and cool down there. It was June, you know. Well, tent living is very casual. I mean, you can sit there on the floor of the tent and chew on your corn, you know, and then throw the cob off into the woods. It's really very casual. But it got a little cold in October. And we didn't have that darn house done yet, and hunting season was coming up, and you knew darn well you weren't going to get it done during hunting season. So I was not really happy. But we were new in town. I'm going to read to you about this chapter that oh, by the way, I wrote this book because I wanted everybody to know what a horrible thing I'd been through naturally. And so the name of this chapter is Backwoods Gourmet. October 1948. There I was at the ripe old age of 22, living in an old army tent beside a brook about a mile out from a little town in the Adirondacks. I was already a veteran of 3 years of married life with a 2-year-old daughter. We were building a house up on the hill, and the tent was only temporary. I have found that temporary is a term used a lot in the Adirondacks. It's something of a permanent condition. The weather was really warm in June when we put up that tent, so we located it near the brook in the shade. The only thing wrong was that it was October and cold, and the roof was not on that house yet. I couldn't wait to get to the general store with my 2-year-old on cold mornings and thaw out with hot chocolate and real toast. We were new in the community. New can be a long time in the Adirondacks, and we were not very well acquainted yet. Down the road in one direction was a large farm. Chickens, cows, corn, and pastures, a very nice farm. Up the road in the other direction lived a large Adirondack family whose matriarch had taken me under her wing. This woman knew everything I needed to learn. She cooked up veritable blizzards of heavenly food on her big wood stove. When we decided, oh, by the way, I should tell you, by the time we moved to that tent, we had a flock of racing pigeons, 3 Cochin Bantam chickens that we picked up at the Vermont State Fair. That was Henrietta 1 and Henrietta 2. They were nice. And we had about 15 dairy goats. We were sure that goats were going to be the coming thing, you know. And we had about 40, rabbits, 40 rabbits. And what else? Oh, the dog had 9 puppies under the floor of the tent. We got her spayed. And the cat had 3 kittens on a basket of clean clothes. I was cooking in a little shelter outside the tent, and I had a hot plate, a gas hot plate with the top of the stove oven. Somebody had a birthday, and I made a cake, and that it's not easy when you're in a tent, you know. Anyway, so I put that cake out to cool. The dog knocked it off, and the dog and the cat ate the whole thing. It was just not easy. Are you all suffering out there? Okay, so we had lots of rabbits. She taught me, the next door lady taught me how to can rabbit meat, which was nice because we had a big butchering, and I can't remember whether we butchered 20 or 40 of them. It's a long time ago. Besides, let's see. So then the nice old lady who lived across the road, she wasn't old, she was only my age. The other lady who lived across the road decided to ask me to join the Rebeccas. I was thrilled. I had no idea what the Rebeccas were, but I could hardly wait to find out. What I discovered was that they were the counterpart of the Oddfellows, one of those benevolent organizations that added some welcome social life to the long winter months. They did turn out to be very nice ladies, and at the first meeting I attended, they were planning a covered dish supper. I soon discovered that at a covered dish supper, you are expected to bring a dish to pass. I was inspired. I went home to my tent and consulted the joy of cooking. And I was still learning to cook, and it was an uphill battle, as you can imagine. Let's see. Yes, there was a recipe in there for chicken pot pie. I figured with just a few substitutions, I could produce a large bowl of it. Rabbit tastes a lot like chicken. We had lots of rabbit. I got out my large yellow Pyrex bowl. He has one out there in the lobby Are they really so old that they're for displaying now? I'm still using mine. Okay, so I got out my large yellow Pyrex bowl, the really big one, and a few cans of mushroom soup, and produced a really tasty pot pie with a lovely biscuit topping. Well, that pot pie made a big hit. The only thing was I noticed as the meal progressed that everybody was requesting another helping of that chicken pie. It occurred to me that I was sailing under false colors. I have always prided myself on being truthful. You all know that, of course. So finally I found it necessary to mention that it was really a rabbit pie. The effect was startling. Everything seemed to stop sort of in midair. The lady from the nice farm down the road turned to me and I noticed that her face was a rather pale green. She looked at me accusingly and said, "I bet you made the crust out of goat milk too, didn't you?" Well, of course I had. And it had not occurred to me that rabbit and goat milk were not considered proper food in this conservative stronghold. Chicken was the proper meat. Also, one did not use goat milk. That's what the cows were for. I was somewhat chagrined to learn this. By the way, this neighbor lady of mine, the one that was such a good Adirondack cook, had a large family, larger than mine. And the one boy used to come down quite a bit, and he always swore he would never drink any of that stuff. So I kept it in a Borden bottle, and he liked it just fine. So if you want to become a legend in your own time, this is the way to go about it. The good ladies of the Rebecca stood by me in spite of my many shortcomings. They tried really hard to straighten me out, and now and then they had some success. Over time, though, it became apparent that some things are beyond help. One can only remain tolerant, and they did. I still remember fondly the lovely shower they gave me when we had our 5th child. That 5th child is somewhat over 50 years old now. The other day, I had lunch with a lady who used to live across the road. She said, "Do you remember when you made that rabbit pie?" I really enjoy being a legend. So that was, by the way, that mushroom soup is very handy. Whatever you do, don't ever be without mushroom soup. Somewhere or other I have a thing about mushroom soup here. Ah, yes, here it is. Living in the Adirondacks is kind of a hand-to-mouth thing. And we never did acquire enough money to have it otherwise. And way back in the 50s, I guess it was, we finally got that house finished. By the way, as soon as I got that house, as we got that house finished, well, it was hunting season, so my husband went hunting naturally. By the way, he was a very good hunter. I should tell you about venison, shouldn't I? That'll come up when we do the mushroom soup thing. I'm not flighty or anything. Are you laughing? My husband, by the way, was Greg. When I met him, you could call him Guns or Greg, and there didn't seem to be any future in Guns, so I called him Greg. And then we had all these children, and we tried to give them the kind of names that you would remember, you know? And we did that, I think. But every now and then, somebody will say, "Oh, I know your son." And I say, "Which one?" And they say, "Well, Greg." They're not Greg. But I could do a whole hour of how to name children, and I won't do that. So, my husband's, Greg's great aunt Essie was Orange Irish. Every St. Patrick's Day she delighted in wearing orange. I don't think it bothered the Catholics at all. At one time, this lady ran a bar and grill in Worcester, Massachusetts. For a wedding present, Aunt Essie gave us a good, sensible, heavy iron frying pan. She said there was no sense trying to cook without at least one iron frying pan. She herself had two, one for bacon and eggs, the other for everything else. Washing them was forbidden. It would ruin the curing. They were only wiped. So, I have always had an iron skillet. Not the one she gave me, though, because I took some frozen venison out of the freezer one time and slapped it into the pan and put the heat on really high under there, because you have to cook it at a high heat. It has to be black on the inside and pink in the middle. You know this. My husband hovered over me till I learned this. And of course, when you do that with something that's frozen solid, it cracked the pan. So I had to get a new one. When Aunt Essie died, we acquired a footstool, a waffle iron, an ironing board, and a whole bunch of wine glasses. Since neither of us drank wine at the time, I used them for desserts. Chocolate pudding with a little whipped cream on top is pretty impressive in wine glasses. It made a big hit with the neighborhood kids. Aunt Essie could see that I needed a lot of guidance, so she gave me one of her old cookbooks. Inside the back cover was written an interesting recipe called Fit for a King. It used cream of mushroom soup for the cream sauce, put in a lot of good stuff featuring crab meat, and said to use it on biscuits. That was my introduction to mushroom soup. Probably by now I have financed a good slice of the mushroom soup company. It's not that I can't make white sauce. I did learn to do that. Really, it's just that the soup is so convenient and tasty. That and the fact that I was too cheap to invest in fresh mushrooms. Suppose, for instance, that I actually bought mushrooms. I would then put a few in the sauce and save the rest, because I'd be so impressed with the cost, I'd want to make them go a long way. Then I would forget to use the rest until they had spoiled, and it would break my heart to throw them away. So mushroom soup has saved my day many, many times. Oh, let's see. I'm going to skip the rabbits. So while we're on that subject, let me tell you about stroganoff. How many do stroganoff? Ah, that looks good. I got a good lesson in stroganoff when I visited my cousin in Coos Bay, Oregon in 1949. She was living there with husband number 2 or 3. I always lose count. When she was 16, Betty had fallen off her horse while riding through a field of hops and broken her back. So she was a paraplegic, and this slowed her down a little. My theory has always been that she spent the rest of her life proving how useful she could be. She got a degree of fine arts from the University of Oregon and supported herself and various husbands with her art. I think there were 5 husbands altogether, although there may have been more. By 1949, Betty had married a bottled water salesman from Los Angeles, and they had decided to move to Coos Bay, where, as near as I could tell, she was supporting them by producing delicately carved jewelry. They lived in a large house and entertained an assortment of friends from up and down the coast. I remember a used car dealer from somewhere in California, and a cook who worked on ships that traveled mostly out of Portland to and from ports in Alaska. While we were there, the cook was producing a large batch of stroganoff for everybody. We ate in the big kitchen, which was half orange and half blue, because those were the colors they had handy, and that was as far as each color would go. The cups were hand-thrown on the potter's wheel. Each was one of a kind and without handles, which were deemed to be unnecessary. I watched the preparation of this dish and noticed that the cook never measured anything, but merely kept his eye on the size of the dinner crowd and tailored his dish accordingly. First of all, he chopped a lot of onion and sautéed it in butter in a huge frying pan. He added 2 or 3 minced garlic cloves, and then he sliced some beef very thinly across the grain, cut these slices into pieces about 1 by 2 inches, and threw them into the pan. After the meat was nicely browned, he added salt and pepper and then a lot of sliced mushrooms. Last was a large quantity of sour cream. It was now ready to serve on vast mountains of rice. It seemed quick and easy, and we all enjoyed it with crusty bread and a tossed salad. Right away, my mind started translating all these ingredients into backwoods fare. By the time I got back to the Adirondacks, it was hunting season again. Greg was diligently slicing venison into steaks, with just some bits and pieces left over. All those bits and pieces became stroganoff. Of course, I had no mushrooms or sour cream, so I started with the onion, and after I got the meat in the pan, I doused it with some vinegar. Then I opened the can of mushroom soup and stirred it in. The hunters loved it. It was always great cooking for those fellows. After a day in the woods, they would eat anything I fixed and love it. As the years went by and our family biblically multiplied, we all thrived on large doses of stroganoff. By 1964, there were 7 children, and we were living in western New York State, where Greg was the district scout executive for the Boy Scouts of America. In the summer, he ran the scout camp, Camp Sam Wood. He worked very hard at keeping within a strict budget and was proud to be able to feed breakfast to the whole camp with a 5-pound bag of oatmeal. He had me write up my stroganoff recipe for the camp cook. In order to make use of the government's surplus canned beef. When the boys saw stroganoff on the menu, they quit eating. So he gave it a new name. He called it the Sam Wood Special, and it was a big hit. Nowadays, I am no longer coping with frugal budgets, and I find that sour cream lasts a long time. I still find that mushroom soup is tasty and convenient, and I add lots of mushrooms too. Also, I'm very inclined to add a splash of whatever wine I'm drinking. Otherwise, that recipe hasn't changed very much. Of course, since Greg died, there's been no more venison. I don't know why I haven't raised any hunters, but beef is good, and stroganoff is always a good dish for sharing with friends. Thank you. And I should tell you that my husband was not only a good hunter, but he was also a good butcher of venison, and it takes a good butcher to know how to butcher venison so that it doesn't have that wild taste. And he was good at that. And he was also a good fisherman. But I'm going to let my number 3 son tell you about fishing. Yeah, just a minute.
Question about the venison. How does the butchery
I'm sorry?
prevent the wild taste?
To get rid of the wild taste, you have to be sure to take all the membranes out, because that's where it is. And we used to send the neck up to my friend, the Adirondack lady that lived nearby, and she would make the most marvelous mincemeat. Okay, Kent, you ready?
Yeah.
This is number 3 son.
Hi. This is about fishing, but it's a little different. And I wonder, is there anybody in the audience who's had native trout? So you know about the native trout, they don't grow very big, and the meat is red. It's just sweet. And we were running a campground at Skern Lake up on top of Charlie Hill. And when we were kids building and running above and beyond campground on Charlie Hill and Skern Lake, we got to meet all kinds of campers from everywhere. Most were from downstate, Canada, or adjacent states like New Jersey or Pennsylvania. Occasionally we'd have folks from farther away like California or Arizona. We got to play ping pong with some champions visiting from China, and in general, we had fun with our campers. One beautiful morning, Barry, Blair, and I were preparing to go fishing down the road a bit at Charlie Hollow. That takes off toward Minerva from Charlie Hill. We had a taste for the native brook trout there, which, though small, had sweeter and redder flesh than the usual hatchery-grown trout. Our preparations amounted to finding the smallest fish hooks we could and the lightest, finest fishing line, usually about 2-pound test, and only a yard or so in length. This caught the eye of a camper finishing up his morning coffee at the snack bar. He couldn't believe we were headed out without poles, lures, waders, or nets. We didn't even carry bait. We told him those items were not only unnecessary, but would ruin our chances to catch these trout. It really piqued his interest, and he begged to come along. So off we went with our new friend, Kenny Simons, from Coral Gables, Florida, just outside Miami. Kenny was older than the rest of us and made his living as a lighting designer and sound technician for big concert venues around southern Florida. He told us stories about Jefferson Airplane and Chuck Berry and other concerts he'd been working at, while we walked a mile or so down Charlie Hollow Road to where a 12-inch culvert carried a minuscule stream of water underneath the dirt road. We followed the stream down to where it filled a tiny pool about the size of a wheelbarrow tub, and from a distance of about 20 feet, we got ready to fish by tying the fishing line to twigs and carefully turning over rocks to find what was underneath for bait. Kenny strode over to the pool, pointed at it, and said something like, "You can't get trout out of that puddle." Barry spoke up at that point. He agreed with Kenny. Since Kenny had clumped over, cast a shadow on the pool, and spoken, we figured that the trout in the pool were aware of us and would not bite. We'd have to try another pool. Kenny figured we were nuts, but he went along with the idea to see what would happen. We explained that the native trout were easily spooked. They could feel vibrations near their pool, so we'd have to sneak up on it. We'd approach the pool walking toward the sun so as not to cast a shadow on it. We used sticks for fishing poles since we figured that the trout would be wary of reflections from metal parts like the guides on fishing poles. We found that the only bait the trout would take came from very nearby and had to be dipped silently and carefully into the pool on those tiny hooks. One person at a time would creep up and dip a bait just beneath the surface of the water. He would watch the bait, and when the trout took it, he'd try his best to pull the hook, bait, and fish cleanly out of the pool so it didn't disturb the water. And that way we could get maybe 2 or 3 fish out of that pool. The delicacy of the operation fascinated Kenny, and if I remember right, we got him to quiet down enough to dip out a trout himself. On the way home, he couldn't stop talking about it. When we ate the fish, he swore it was the best he ever had. The whole experience was so different from any fishing he'd ever done that he felt he had to describe to us the Florida method for catching sharks in the canals. Now, Florida has lots of aqueducts and canals. Some are for boating, but most are for drainage or irrigation. Occasionally a shark will get in the canal and perhaps eat a local dog or cause a nuisance. Kenny described chaining a truck tire inner tube to a bridge over the canal. And then he would clamp an aircraft cable to the other side of that inner tube, and with a length of cable, and at the end of the cable he would have a 1.5 foot treble hook. That's a 3-pronged hook, 1.5 feet tall, very different from what we were using for trout fishing. And then they'd take a couple of live chickens and put them on the hooks and throw it into the canal. The chickens would make enough commotion that the shark would be attracted. The shark would come up and grab the chickens, and when he tried to make off with them, the inner tube would stretch and set the hook. Then they would kill the shark with high-powered rifles and shotguns. They didn't even eat it. We boys were horrified to hear of this, and of course became great friends. And I want to tell you how Mother's home cooking helped save my life. Sweet knots are a finished pastry made with cardamom. That's one of my mother's specialties. We have them for big dinners like Thanksgiving and Easter, and whenever we stop by and Mother has some out, they're a big favorite with the Gregson clan. Years ago, when I was in the hospital for a bypass operation, my mother brought sweet knots for the doctors, nurses, and staff who were doing such a good job putting me back together. Everybody loved them, and one of the nurses wanted to know if she could get a recipe to try making them at home. I don't think Mother had seen the recipe since the 60s. Here's what my mother brought along with another dozen sweet knots on her next visit. It had a place of honor on the nurse's refrigerator. Dear Barbara.
Oh, Ken,
Oh, corrections?
that's 2 pages long, and so I made copies so anybody that's interested can get them, so you don't have to read them okay?
Oh, really?
Forgot to tell you that, didn't I?
Yes.
2 or 3 other things, but I'll think of them later.
This one?
No, this one and this
This one says Dear Barbara. That one says Dear Barbara.
was... I was pretty efficient when I got up this morning. It didn't last. Yeah, these are the ones. Yeah, I'll put them over here, and I'll interrupt you later.
Oh, okay. So, should I move to the next story then? All right.
So tell them about your brother.
Okay. She's referring to my brother Lance, which would be son number 7?
No.
No, son number...
Seven, son.
Right, son number 5. Sorry. Even I'm losing track. In our family, it's a Christmas tradition to go out and get a Christmas tree that will reach the ceiling. It was also a yearly enterprise to supply the area where we were with Christmas wreaths, roping, and balsam and greens by the ton. With 7 kids to supply gifts for Christmas morning, that enterprise was what made Christmas happen for us, and we knew it as kids. Mother talks about how clever she figured it was to convince us of that, but we could easily see it was true. So, when we moved to the Catskill Mountains, the largest council Boy Scout camp in the world, 10 Mile River, with its 12,000 acres, it was a little trouble to acquire a 12-foot tree for our, it was little trouble to acquire a 12-foot tree for our new living room that had a cathedral ceiling. The trouble was that the tree took up more than half of the width of the living room at the bottom, and it didn't look right to have 1/2 of a tree, because what we had to do was take the limbs off of one side and push it up against the glass. And there's the glass wall there and the tree up against it. And so we ended up with half a Christmas tree. Well, that didn't seem right, so we got another Christmas tree, cut half of the limbs off it, and put it on the outside of the house. And decorated it up so that it looked like one Christmas tree. And people going by on the road would stop and back up and have another look. We had a great time with that. When we moved back to Stern Lake in the Adirondack Mountains and moved to an old barn that we made into a house, among other things, we ended up with a 17-foot, 4-inch ceiling height. Soon Father had us kids in dog sled harnesses, and we were hauling a huge balsam through a couple of feet of snow to fill up the big new living room. And that was fun. We made a nice tradition of that. And after Father died, most of us kids lived elsewhere, and the place was occupied by Mother Jill and Lance, the youngest of us. Lance, being the man of the house, felt it was his task to get the Christmas tree, and since he was old enough to drive and skip school, he went down by the Northway at Thurman Pond, where we were getting our greens at the time, along the side of a high-tension wire, power line right-of-way. And maybe 13,000 volts or so. The cut for the right-of-way allowed good growth on the double balsam that we preferred for wreaths. There he saw a tree that looked good for the family Christmas tree. Actually, what he thought would be a good Christmas tree was the top 20 feet of an 80-foot tall balsam, growing nice and full where it was above the other trees. Lance wasted little time getting up the tree with a small chainsaw and proceeded to take what he figured was the top 20 feet. Naturally, he fell the top toward the right-of-way so that it would reach the ground, hopefully landing on its butt. I should have double spaced. Imagine his surprise when the tree toppling over slapped the first conductor of the power line into the second conductor of the power line. And he thanked his lucky stars that he didn't get electrocuted. And as soon as the tree stopped swaying, the tree that he was on, he climbed on down and draped the balsam over the long-suffering pickup truck, which, of course, working by himself would take a while. But he was on the road and headed home when he saw the helicopter coming up the power line to examine the short circuit he had caused. Apparently, he had shut down a substation that supplied power to Pottersville, Schroon Lake, and North Hudson. Lance was not forthcoming about his adventure immediately upon returning home, since upon his arrival the power was out again and Mother was on the phone berating the power company for the unreliability of their power supply. Yeah. Well, that house is my brother Barry and his wife Darlene's now, and still gets a 17-foot, 4-inch tall Christmas tree every year. Now, thank you. Now, you may have noticed in that story there was no food. Mother has the remedy for that here. You have the remedy for that?
For what?
Since there was no food in that story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can take care of that.
Thank you, Ken. We got 10 minutes. I'm going to bore you some more, by golly. Oh, I should tell you before I get carried away here like I always do, that Christmas was when we always made gingerbread men. And so I brought a batch of them for you all to sample when we're through here. And that was what I was trying to remember, yes, I think. Oh, and about those rolls, I've got some recipes over there, and anybody that's interested can have one, and if you don't get one, let me know and I'll see that you do, okay? Let's see now, what else was I going to talk about? There was something here. Oh, those are, oh yeah. Oh yes, the cranberries. I think we just have time enough for me to tell you about cranberries. The nice thing that I discovered about the Adirondacks is cranberries grow there. So I wrote this thing. And I could tell you, but it would take twice as long, so I'll just read it. There is a meadow beside a small lake in the northern part of Warren County in the southern Adirondacks where longhorn cattle graze. Only about 45 years ago, that meadow was awash in cranberries. Over by the road there used to be huge old butternut trees, and every spring there were swarms of white and lavender lilac trees mixed in with a few apple blossoms. In the fall, along the lake, there were bushels of cranberries ripening. I was truly amazed to find that cranberries grew here in the wilds of the Adirondacks. And I tell you, when I came up here, I discovered that these were wilds. And of course, where I came from, everything was so much more orderly. So I might have told you that they really grew in cellophane packages in the supermarket. Except that I remembered the labels on those bags that referred to bogs in Massachusetts and New Jersey. So I was pretty sure you needed an ocean. And even more convinced that hip boots were required. As usual, I was wrong. Here was this vast meadow strewn with cranberries, and boots were unnecessary. Right after the first good frost, we were out there harvesting those bushels of cranberries. A lot of them were still green, or to be more precise, white. We stored them in our basement just as they were. Whenever we wanted cranberries for anything, it was really simple to go down there and sort out some nice red ones until we had enough. If they ripened faster than we used them, we just put them in the freezer in plastic bags. We enjoyed cranberry juice, cranberry jelly, cranberry sauce, cranberry bread, cranberry salad, cranberry apple pie, and cranberry relish. I had two favorites. One was that cranberry relish. This was just a combination of 4 cups of cranberries put through the fine fitting on the old meat grinder, along with 1 large orange, skin and all. Add 2 cups of sugar, stir it all together, and keep it in the refrigerator till it's all used up. Wonderful with turkey. The other favorite was cranberry bread. I got the recipe out of that handy Betty Crocker cookbook. And there was a recipe for fruit loaf on page 81, and it said use 1 cup of grated apple or other fruit. So I used cranberries. It was good. And I've got that recipe in this chapter, but I'm not going to bore you with that. About 15 years ago, that lovely meadow was sold to a man who runs a nearby dude ranch. No more cranberries. He cut down the trees, and his cattle have been grazing there ever since. During the first years of his tenure, the fences were a little chancy, and the cattle had a tendency to wander. At the campground on the other side of that lake, it was sometimes a shocking experience for a camper to wake in the morning to find a longhorn staring soulfully at him through the tent flap. Oh, I had to put that in because I used to work at that campground, and people would come running down to my office and they would say, "There's a big creature at my tent." And I would say, "There's no added charge for that." When the campground owner pointed out to the cattleman the problems he might encounter with insurance costs and out-of-court settlements, the fences became much stronger. These days, when we need cranberries for our Adirondack treats, we visit the swamp at the lower end of another nearby lake. This time, boots are necessary. It would never do to visit the supermarket and look for one of those cellophane bags. It just wouldn't be the same. And one time, I forget what year it was that they were having that scare about cancer-causing spray that they were using on the cranberries, so everybody was not buying cranberries. And we had some company over for dinner, and we had, of course, our wild cranberry sauce. It was Thanksgiving, you know, and they wouldn't eat any because they were scared to death of getting cancer. At the same time, though, they did smoke a lot. So I would entertain any questions that you might have. What, you're all satisfied? No problems, huh?
We're hungry.
Well, when I get through making a big noise up here, you're all invited to come over here and have a cookie and have a recipe if you like. And if you want to buy some books, that's okay too. But you don't have to have a cookie.
Carol, do you still have that old Joy of Cooking book?
I do.
I do too. I grew up with that my early married life.
The cover fell
It's
off
like
a
an
long...
encyclopedia.
Hmm?
It's like an
Oh,
encyclopedia.
yeah. The cover fell off a long time ago.
Yeah.
The other one from Betty Crocker, I used to store all the letters and pictures and things in there. It got so big I had to get it all out and put it in a file. But that's where you live, you know, in those cookbooks.
Well, there's a good stroganoff recipe in the Joy of Cooking too, where I got mine.
You know what? I never ever bothered to look for
I
it.
look for it.
I'll have to go home and look it up.
It's traditional. I mean, you know, it's
Yeah,
using
it's
sour
good
cream
stuff.
and mushrooms and
Okay, so it's time for anybody that wants to have a cookie.